Hey guys, jumping in here with a special little episode before we get to Kelly and I. So some of you know I did a little series for my friends at One Campfire called Faces of Wildlife. This series is about conservation in British Columbia, and I'm quite proud of it. I got to meet a lot of cool people. I learned a shitload of stuff, and I'm proud of the series. I want to hear more people listening to it. So Faces of Wildlife is available on all streaming platforms, and you can also find it at onecampfire.com. I'd love it if you headed over there and had a look at what they're up to. Again, that website is campfire.com. There's recipes, there's written articles, there's some films up there that I'm lucky to have been a part of. All kinds of good stuff. So again, onecampfire.com, head over, support those guys. They've got lots of exciting stuff coming up in the new year here, so keep an eye on their website. You can also find them on Instagram and Facebook and all that good stuff. So let's get into this one. This is an episode I did on the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. I wanted to learn more about how that was funded and how they choose the programs they want to put money into and the people and all that good stuff. So this is myself and Brian Springinotic in Victoria, British Columbia, talking about HCTF. So sit back, relax, crack a cold beer, and enjoy this special episode of Faces of Wildlife.
I look at the tourism marketing in this province, Supernatural BC, that's a brand that resonates globally. And if you look at the marketing materials that they use, it's fantastic landscapes. They put caribou, they put grizzly bear, they put all of these iconic species on the marketing materials. But I'm not convinced that there's enough investment going into the actual foundational base of that brand, which is the public land of BC and the species that live in that habitat.
On this episode of Faces of Wildlife, I'm in Victoria, British Columbia, speaking with Brian Springinotic to learn more about the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation.
Well, my name is Brian Springinotic. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation.
I said this about Revelstoke too, but Victoria and Vancouver Island in general is one of my favorite places to visit in the province. Most people come to the island to view aquatic wildlife, but Vancouver Island is home to a plethora of land critters, including black bear, black-tailed deer, which are closely related to our friend the mule deer, Roosevelt elk, cougars, gray wolves, and grizzly bears have now made their way onto the island too. Being surrounded by so much biodiversity, coupled with HCTF's location on the Gorge Waterway in Victoria, this seemed like the perfect location to talk about how fish, wildlife, and habitat conservation projects are funded in the province.
We're a charity, registered charity, a not-for-profit, but we're also the trustee of a trust that exists in the Wildlife Act. And that is a pot of money that is primarily driven by surcharges on angling, hunting, trapping, and guide outfitting licenses. We receive that money. It's held in trust, and we're the trustee of that trust. And we run a process to reinvest those monies back into important conservation, fish, wildlife, and habitat projects across BC.
Fish, wildlife, and habitat have always been a topic for discussion in British Columbia, but it took an unexpected meeting in the 70s to bring HCTF to life.
Started up actually back in the day in the late 70s. This is a story I was told. There was a meeting of the cabinet in Cranbrook, I think into the south probably in Cranbrook at the time, late 1970s. And that would have been Bill Bennett Jr. was the premier at the time. And they were receiving presentations from members of the community, and they were slated to have a 15-minute conversation with representatives from the Wildlife Federation, the guide outfitters, the trappers. I think they were all there. Again, this is third hand. I obviously wasn't there at the time. What was supposed to be a 15 or 20-minute presentation turned into a 2-hour discussion. And those representatives of those groups had this idea that something needed to be done and more investments needed to be made in conservation and fish and wildlife in the province. And they were prepared to step up and make those investments. And that's the start. That's what started HCTF. So the government machinery clanked into gear, and by 1981, the Habitat Conservation Trust, Habitat Conservation Fund was its original name. And it lived in government for many, many years, from 1981 to 2003. And then we started to move out of government. By 2007, we were completely separate from government. And the main change that took place is that first phase, 1981 to 2003, The actual minister, an elected politician, made all of the funding decisions. Now, he had an advisory board made up of anglers, hunters, trappers, guides, but they only gave him advice. And he or she, whoever was the minister, made the decisions. In 2003, when we made those changes, we changed the decision maker from the minister to a board made up of people who contribute to the fund. So they became decision makers, those representatives of the BC Wildlife Federation, the guide outfitters, and the trappers, and government as well, and then some at-large members.
As HCTF approaches its 40th anniversary, it goes without saying that they have earned the trust of the province. They have funded 2,800 projects, have purchased over 25,000 hectares of conservation lands in British Columbia, and have awarded $180 million in grant money. That's a lot of cash. So where does all that money come from? Well, it comes from a number of places, but the majority of it has always come from hunters, anglers, trappers, and guide outfitters that purchase annual licenses to hunt and fish in the province.
By law, by the terms of the Wildlife Act, we get all the surcharge money. The province gets all the fee money, but the proportions are roughly the same, 70-30, 80-20. It varies a little bit from licensed product to licensed product, but across all products, it's still about the same. 70% is fee, 20-30% is surcharge. So that's what we get, right? You know, an example, I buy my annual angling license, $36 as a resident of BC. 29 of those dollars stay with the province and then go on to the Freshwater Fisheries Society. 7 come to HCTF. So we get 20 to 25 cents on every dollar when someone comes to BC and buys an angling, hunting, trapping, or guiding license. At the start of every year, we tell our board, here's how much money we think you're going to get from angling surcharges and hunting surcharges. And if it's angling surcharge money, we keep it in freshwater or aquatic projects. Not by law, not even by regulation, but just as a matter of policy. Now, the board can vary from that if they want, but they don't do that very much. If it's a hunting surcharge, it goes to a wildlife or a terrestrial project, right? We try and keep that fidelity. So it's an interesting model. And while we're a charity, a registered charity and a not-for-profit, we don't actually fundraise, because that money comes to us every time someone makes a license purchase. And the groups, as I say, that represent those license purchasers sit on the board and make the decisions about where that money goes. And I think it's a pretty tight model.
Luckily, hunting and angling surcharges aren't the only sources of revenue. Private donors and other organizations have stepped up to get involved too. And interestingly, court awards have come into play, giving judges the opportunity to make guilty parties pay into the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation.
It seems to be attracting attention. We're increasing our revenues from other organizations and other entities that want to give us money. You know, when I started here in 2003, about 95% of our income came from licenses. That's down into the 70, high 60s, low 70 right now. Not because those are declining, although angling license sales are down, but because other people are bringing us money and want us to manage it. And they like the process we use to match up money with high quality conservation projects. For wildlife and forested habitats, and we have this partnership with FESBC, they have taken a look at the process we use to make our own investments, and they basically said, well, we like that process. And we're foresters, we're not wildlife biologists, so we're just going to use your process. So you show us, after you've done your technical review and your board decisions, etc., show us all of the ones that are in forested habitats, and we'll have a look at those and we'll invest 50 cents on the dollar on those. So we're 50-50 joint funders. So it's a relatively easy exercise for them, and it's, again, a multi-million-dollar partnership, and they look at our process as the mechanism to put their money to work for wildlife in BC. So that's another revenue source. Court awards is an interesting, this is a bit of a paradox for me personally and for the organization. So, there's provision in 5 different environmental statutes, Water Act, the Wildlife Act, Environmental Management Act, I can't remember the other 2 acts, where it explicitly identifies the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation as the recipient of awards for convictions under those acts. So you're, as an individual or as a company, convicted of some bad environmental action out there, that goes to a judge, and one of the judge's sentencing options is a fine. Sure, could do a fine, and that goes to government's main account, and it goes to all the things government does. But as a presiding judge, one of your options is to say, no, I'm going to make this guilty party pay the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation money, and can then direct us about what we can spend that money on. And the reason I say it's a paradox is, in a perfect world, those environmental damages and harms and crimes wouldn't be taking place. But we don't kind of live in that perfect world. We live in the world we live in, and sometimes they do take place. And in those events where a judge so directs, that money comes to us, and we put it back into the system to fund highly technically ranked, well thought out conservation projects. And it's maybe a sign of the times, but the amount of money we're receiving from that venue is increasing. And I think it's partly a function of, I'm not convinced that there's a bunch more environmental damage happening out there, although I'm on the bubble about that one. But I think what is happening is judges are imposing ever larger penalties. And we're in this very fortunate position, favored position to be so named by the courts and so named by the provincial legislation that we take that real seriously. We have a report on our website that's from 96 to 2004, I think it is, that says, here's where the money came from, here's the projects that went to support. And we're just in the final stages of updating that, bringing the second edition of that report to bring it up to the current day so people can see, where does HCTF actually put that money that they receive from court awards, right? And we blend it with some of our surcharge money, or maybe some of the money we have from Forest Enhancement Society, because again, our process is harvest ideas from British Columbians about good things to do for fish and wildlife, run it through our technical review process. Here's the winners. Well, let's fund them from surcharge, from court award money, from the Forest Enhancement Society, whoever else is prepared to bring money to the table to support those projects.
I asked Brian about current projects and which ones have him excited. I was delighted to hear that the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project, which we discussed in episode 1, was one of them.
Yeah, there's a few. And what is it that hits that kind of sweet spot of things that checks all the boxes for you? And some of the ones I like are ones that have a bunch of different partnerships. So you got a bunch of different players at the table. It includes communities and also brings science, right? And I think of something like the mule deer work that is taking place in the Southern Interior. It's headed up by UBC Okanagan. Adam Ford's leading that. But think about, there's the Wildlife Federation is involved in that. Clubs are involved in that. So club members are actually playing a role to support that science. It's got linkages to wildfire. And you think about the expanding presence of fire on the land base in British Columbia and the work that we need to do to understand what does that mean for wildlife in this province. And so that one really, we started funding that, I think it was last year. We're still funding it. It's a multi-year project. We're back in the project this year. I love those, just because there's so many players and it's so relevant to what's going on. There's a few others. We're funding a project up in the Prince George country to get a better understanding about the impact of herbicide use on ungulate forage. There's lots of talk about that, but what does the science tell us? And not just the lab science that someone's doing some sort of, theoretical work. What does it tell us about what's actually happening in British Columbia? I know people are really anxious about this, and part of the reason for this investment is to go from that anxiety to fact. What do we know is actually happening on the ground? So that one resonates, for me. I'm trying to think of some others. We've got some habitat. We're often involved in habitat restoration projects, and those appeal to me because they're broad-based on the land and they check boxes for multiple species. You might be targeting sheep or you might be targeting ungulates, but there's generally benefits for a whole suite of species, and those ones really work for me as well. Got some caribou projects on the go. Caribou's a hot topic, and the province gave us a bunch of money to invest in caribou habitat restoration projects, so those are kind of timely. Too soon to tell what the results are going to be on those. Some of the projects that stick in your mind, I can remember one, and it's long past now, but the stories that sort of emanate from those projects. And I'll never forget this. We're funding a project to understand the dynamics of wolverine populations in the Manning Park country. And it was transboundary. A lot of collars on wolverines and follow what kind of habitat do they need. It's high elevation, they need deep snow in the winter, et cetera, et cetera. And these anomalies pop out of the study. And there was this one, I heard the story from the researcher, he was telling me this one subadult female, for whatever reason, she just books it straight north to Merritt from Manning Park. So following the low elevation grassland during the day, this is wildly unusual sort of behavior for a wolverine. Obviously she didn't care. And she stopped. That collar stopped moving just outside of Merritt. And they thought she was dead. So when it stops for over 24 hours, or I forget how long, they go out and see. Well, by the time they get there, she's not there anymore, but they found a cow. She'd been camped on a dead cow for 3 days, just eating on that cow, right? Get back, follow the collar. She's booking it west, straight down to the river to Spence's Bridge. Again, what is a wolverine doing in that low elevation grassland? And crossed the Fraser River, went up the Stein, and stopped again. And sadly, when they went out and found that collar, she'd been killed and eaten by probably a grizzly bear. But again, these behaviors of animals Those are a lot of the things that stick in my mind. Again, I can remember seeing, I grew up in Vernon and contacted about a mountain goat in Cal Lake Park. And I'm going, yeah, well, there's no mountain goats in Cal Lake Park. Sure enough, some goat had gotten it, verified by a bunch of different people, gotten it in his or her mind to go into the low elevation grassland, see what's going on. So that's part of what I love about this job, is your connection with some of those projects, and just the kind of diversity and the breadth of experience about what wildlife are doing in this province. It's amazing, just amazing. You know, we think we know what's going on out there. We often don't really know what's going on out there, right? And it's expensive to find out. You think about Adam's project, collars on animals, huge footprint to the project, and the role that lots of local members of rod and gun clubs and naturalist clubs and whoever else is involved, eyes and ears, and citizen scientists to support that role, right? That's the way of the future, in my opinion, because we can't afford to do things any other way, frankly.
The projects Brian just mentioned are big ones. And as he just said, they're costly ones too. But you might be surprised to learn that anyone, including you, can apply for funding through HCTF.
Well, I mean, we have quite a few different granting programs, but as an opening position, by and large, anybody's eligible to apply. But to talk about some of our larger granting programs, our main, what we call our enhancement and restoration granting program, anybody can apply, but it's a pretty rigorous technical review process. Right, and it's an 8 or 9 page proposal, and and you know, this is where we spend the bulk of our money. We have a fairly rigorous proposal information requirements. We run that through a multi-stage technical review because we want to test the validity of that proposal, and we want a lot of expert opinion about, is it well designed, is it going to achieve a known and compelling management problem, is it going to provide measurable conservation benefits, etc. So that's our enhancement and restoration granting program. We have another granting program called the Public Conservation Assistance Fund, which is different. Smaller dollar amounts, a 2-page proposal, maximum $10,000. PCAF, as we call it, is an interesting one because it requires 50% of the value of the project to be volunteer labor. So this is really targeted at your local rod and gun club, your fish and game club, maybe your naturalist club, who want to go out and do some on-the-ground gumboot conservation work in their community. Riparian vegetation replanting, putting up bird boxes for bluebirds, just all those sorts of things, right? So we've got a variety of granting programs kind of targeted at different demographics, if you will, or different client bases. And I you know, we've got a website like everybody else, and ours seeks to kind of guide people through that. What's the nature of your idea? And we do have a kind of a decision tree and a table that shows all of our different granting programs. And of course, you can contact staff anytime. Like, go to www.hctf.ca. We've got a contact list there. Give us a call about your idea, and we can give you some advice about how you might want to apply. And grant amounts, as I say, vary from anywhere from a few $1,000s to up into 6 figures, right? And acquisition projects in particular tend to be large. Land prices in this province are not going down, they're only going up, and it's getting harder and harder to pull the partnerships together. And we rely on other organizations, Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, the Nature Trust. Lots of the land trust organizations in this province do fantastic work. But land prices are going up, available funds are kind of flat at best, right? So those are even more kind of sophisticated, you know? So there's a continuum from your very simple and straightforward Public Conservation Assistance Fund projects all the way through to acquisition proposals, which are quite complex. Because we're putting $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 on the table, we have a lot of T's to cross and a lot of I's to dot before we're going to cut somebody a check that large.
Obviously, you need to have a good idea and some research to back it up. But it's pretty cool to me that anyone with a passion for conservation can get involved and apply for funding. Educating the next generation about the importance of conservation is key, and educators have an opportunity to get more kids outside.
You know, we have this kind of mantra in the organization and around the board table that if you don't know about it, you're not going to care about it. You know, if nobody cares about it, then it's done for, right? And so one of the things that we've been doing is investing in all the different, both elementary, middle school, moving into high schools, to connect kids to conservation, right? To get them out of the classroom, to get them away from screens, and to get them into the natural environment, to connect them to that natural environment. And it's one of our programs, for example, the GO grant program, GO, G-O, Get Outdoors, small, and in some cases, I mean really small grants to classrooms and schools, like a few $100s to get classrooms and their students and their teachers out into the natural environment to learn about water quality, to learn about the importance of, fresh, clean, cool water for salmon and salmonids, to learn about the importance of wetlands, everything that flows from the provincial curriculum around science and environmental science. Again, and we had a role in defining that curriculum. So we now build programs to get young British Columbians connected to those conservation values by, as I say, these small grants. It's shocking to me what an elementary school or middle school teacher can do for a few $100. You pay for the bus, you might pay for someone to support the tour, and they're out there. And these are not one-offs, right? The way we've structured that particular program is they have to have a plan about what they're going to do pre-learning before they go out, what they're going to do while learning, and then what they're going to do post-trip to maximize that learning. So this ain't just a day off, right? We're not interested in that. We're interested in truly connecting these students in these schools, and the uptake is fantastic, right? It's just unbelievable. The demand is fantastic. And so demand far outstrips our ability to meet that demand, but we continue to attract partners. We had the province of BC come, saw the program, understood that a number of these classrooms were going out to parks, because a lot of communities have provincial parks, and they basically came and said, we'll fund those ones. So it was a real vote of confidence for how we designed that program, that it would attract an external investor and say, you run your program, you get all those grant applications, but the ones that are happening in parks and meet your technical standards, send those to us. We'll provide the funding for those ones. And again, I think it's just a vote of confidence in the process and in the need to get young British Columbians connected, right, to fish, to wildlife, to habitats. Whether they become anglers, hunters, trappers, guides, that's another question. But we know for sure they're never going to even get into those activities if they're completely unconnected from the natural environment, especially urban kids. I mean, you look at the population dynamics of this province, it is a largely urban place. If you look at the whole scope of British Columbians, and we got to get those people connected to the natural environment because they're voters. And if they're not connected to it, it's not going to manifest in how they conduct themselves as adults in the future. Kids, teachers, parents. I mean, we got tons of testimonials, and it's up on our website, in our HCTF education website. There's a huge response. They just, there's a hunger for this, right? And we're not part of the nature school. There was a nature education program in the Greater Victoria School District where certain schools were spending their full year on this. We're supporters of that, but that was a school district initiative. And you look at the lineup of parents around the block to get their kids into those programs. There is a real need for this, right? And there's lots of academic research to support this. Richard Louv and Last Child in the Woods. I mean, this nature deficit disorder, it's not restricted to British Columbia. Absolutely not. It's, I assume, a Western phenomenon, but it's real, and it's something that we think we have a small role to play to try and redirect that, to close that deficit, to close that gap about young British Columbians being connected to conservation, to fish, and to wildlife, and fresh air and fresh water, right?
You heard Brian say, if you don't know about it, you're not going to care about it. It's a personal question, but I asked him, as I typically do with all my guests, why people should care about wildlife and habitat.
I grew up here and got to live in the Okanagan, and have lived in the Kootenays and lived up north, and now live on Vancouver Island. And to me, it's just such a central part of the culture of being a British Columbian. That's why. In my opinion, that's why they should care. I mean, you can talk about them as a wildlife as a barometer of ecosystem health, and the fact that we all need healthy air and water and sustainable watersheds, et cetera, and that wildlife are a barometer for that. You can talk about it in those terms, and those terms are true, absolutely. You can talk about the monetary value of the guiding industry, or the resident, what the injection of funding into local economies that resident hunters make, or anglers, or whatever. You can talk about it in those terms, and and that's that's all true. But it's a bit too mechanistic for me, though. What's really important to me is that we have this kind of obligation, right, to sustain those populations. We took this road trip to a number of road trips up north, and I can remember the first year we ran into the porcupine caribou herd. I'd never seen that many caribou in one place in my life. I was shocked. We were up last year, that was about 7 years ago, right? We went up last year, we saw one caribou on the whole trip, right? A single caribou over 10,000 kilometers. We didn't see a single moose. We went up the Alaska Highway, and I came down to Stewart Cassiar. Not a single moose. And I don't know, that's anecdotal, that's one trip. What the hell does that mean? Anything, really. But to me, the absence of those things on the landscape is hugely meaningful to me. And I think it is for a lot of British Columbians.
If you listen to our caribou episodes, you'll know that I said that I had never seen a caribou in the wild. Well, that has changed. I got to travel to a place called Old Crow, which is in the Arctic Circle in the Yukon. I was guided by a local First Nations man named Paul, and he told me how quickly things are changing in the north. The porcupine herd that Brian just mentioned is the same herd that I saw in Old Crow, and they are one of the healthiest populations in the country. But as Paul explained to me, there will be challenges for these caribou in the not-too-distant future as the climate continues to change. So, we all have some work to do, and we can all get involved in one way or another. And that's what the series is here for. It is meant to inspire you, and even myself, to get outside, to learn more, to get involved, and to care more about wildlife and habitat conservation in our province, in our country, and around the world. We're lucky to have so much biodiversity here, but it can all disappear slowly but surely. As Jesse Zeman said, it could all end up in a museum someday, and we'll be left wishing we had made changes when we had the opportunity to do so. To learn more about the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, go to hctf.ca. You can check out all of the projects that have received funding over the years, which includes the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project from Episode 1, the Sheep Translocation Project from Episode 2, and caribou projects we covered in Episodes 3 and 4. Knowing that HCTF was involved in all the projects we've covered, it's pretty cool that we got to end off the series with them. But we'll be back next week with one more concluding episode to wrap the series up. Faces of Wildlife is brought to you by One Campfire. If you'd like to become a supporter of the show, you can send an email to info@onecampfire.com. Faces of Wildlife is written, engineered, produced, and hosted by me, Mike Peterson. Editing, mixing, and mastering was done at Mountain Stream Audio Productions in Kelowna, British Columbia. Intro music by Elk the Moose. Incidental music by Isaac Balson. Special thank you to Brian Springinotic for his time on this episode. We'll be back in 1 week with the conclusion of Faces of Wildlife. For more on this series, head over to onecampfire.com. There you have it. Faces of Wildlife. Guys, do me a favor. Let's get this thing some traction. Go to iTunes, leave a rating and review for me on there. I would greatly appreciate it. Share it with your friends. There's a bunch of episodes up there for this mini-series, and I think you'll learn a few things, but it's kind of geared more towards people who don't know a whole lot about conservation. And I was thinking about myself before I started hunting and how little I knew about how conservation works in this province and how it's funded, shall we say underfunded. So share these, get them out there, and maybe there'll be more. Who knows what'll happen. But thanks for listening to this one. And as you guys know, we have a special episode with Kelly and I. Don't miss it. Big news. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you then. Cheers.